Good evening, BVM family, and thank you for joining us for this urgent and timely conversation tonight about boycotting and divestment in the age of Trump 2.0, lessons from 2020 and beyond. We took a little break. I know you haven't seen us in a while. We took some time in July to rest and reset. Yet still, we are back in full effect for our Policy Corner series, the first of the end of the summer, fall of 2025. As always, Black Voters Matter is a safe space for our righteous rage. And boy, do we have a dynamic panel for you all tonight. But I first want to set the table a little bit. We're 8 months into this Trump 2.0 tyrannical dictatorship. And it is very clear that we're living in a moment of escalating and dehumanizing attacks, particularly on Black communities and other marginalized groups in the public and private spaces. So, how do we fight back? Well, there are many ways to do that. And one of the tools tonight we will be discussing is boycotting and divestment. You've seen all the protests out in the streets in response to the Trump administration, and the backlash is not happening in isolation. The Trump agenda is part of a broader authoritarian shift in American politics. Project 2025 is no longer just a blueprint, it is a roadmap that includes the elimination of DEI in the public and private spaces. Just one of many ways in which this current administration is trying to move us, particularly Black folks, back into the margins of society. So, we want to connect the dots tonight around authoritarian governance, Project 2025 as a roadmap, the erosion of DEI, and the disproportionate impact, particularly on Black women and Black communities. This is not just a roadmap. This is a pattern of that is unmistakable. This is a systemic rollback, of the decades of civil rights progress. In recent years, we've seen communities respond with boycotts, public demonstrations, divestment, and tonight we're discussing what that looks like now and what tools boycotting, protesting, and divestment are that are still powerful to us in 2025. What have we learned from past movements, and what must we do differently moving forward to sustain our efforts? So I am incredibly honored tonight to be joined by an incredible panel of guests hailing from the great states of North Carolina and Florida. So, without further ado, I want to pass the mic to our esteemed guests, and I will have them introduce themselves.
Hey there, I don't know who wants to go first. I don't mind. Hi, everyone. I'm Bree Newsome-Bass. I am probably most known for taking the flag down, the Confederate flag down in South Carolina in 2015. Heavily involved in a lot of grassroots organizing. And so this conversation, I'm completely here for. Thank you for having me. Ready to have it.
Welcome. Senator Bullard.
Hey, everybody. Former Senator Dwight Bullard, currently the senior political advisor at Florida Rising. Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be on the call. Looking forward to the conversation.
Senator Jones.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chevron Jones, State Senator for District 34 in the state of Florida. I get to serve with this good man, Dwight Bullard, and I am just so happy to be here with you all here today. And I am also looking forward to the conversation and the strategy for us to move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining me tonight, and I look forward to you all sharing your thoughts and expertise as we endure, not only survive, but thrive in these trying times. So my first question is, in regards to how boycotting and divestment shows up for each of you, whether it's through your work or personally in your communities. And I want to take us back to 2020, if you will, with me. Picture it. There's a pandemic going on. And on top of that, there's this racial reckoning happening. So, but first, I want you all to share how boycotting in the last 5 years and divestment have shown up in your respective states, your work, or personally.
Yeah,
Senator Bullard?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump out there. had a wave of emotion. You said think back to the pandemic. That was
Agree.
forever ago, but it was critical because in this kind of time and place where we were all stuck at home, how we decided to move about this, as you framed it, the racial reckoning at that time had a lot to do with where we chose to spend our dollars, how we chose to spend our dollars, where we, made significant investments. One of the interesting dynamics of that time period was the pandemic brought about the closure of a number of Black businesses because of all the things, right? People weren't able to go to restaurants, to shop in person. And so a lot of our stuff shifted to online. Subsequently, though, you also saw really, I like to say, proliferation of online Black businesses, opportunities for Black entrepreneurship to really take hold online in the digital space. You saw the, kind of advent of Black Twitter when it was still Twitter, right? Where folks were exchanging different places where they could not only gather information, where they could gather materials, whether it was the printing of Black Lives Matter flags and signs, whether it was the different T-shirt vendors that made themselves available because of the number of marches that were taking place across the world, but especially across the country. And so when I think about that time period, especially over the last 5 years, it's not as deliberate as, let's say, the Montgomery bus boycott was. It was really about new targeted investment in Black spaces, with Black vendors, with Black entrepreneurship, and the ability to set up, create, and optimize the ability to create these things. Like, you had folks that were, using online providers to create these materials and then drop shipping them across the country in kind of a direct response to the moment. And so that kind of is what I think about when I think about the moment, was being able to find folks, being able to find each other, and being able to utilize each other, because that's all we had at that moment since we're all stuck inside.
And to piggyback off Senator Bullard, if you think about it, we were going through a series of pandemics at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. And one of them was one that had never ended, right? And that was what was always have been happening within our community. And as Senator Bullard said, there was a moment in time to where Black folk, we always figure it out. And we did that in that moment also, but we did it more collectively because we all were in the same predicament. We couldn't go nowhere. So we were really stuck with each other through a virtual sense. So there was no other route to go but to collaborate. The problem was that while we were collaborating, trying to build, knowing that we were doing it in a very wholesome way, there were other individuals using the system to do it in a way that we never had access to. So we weren't able to sustain what we were building. And so when you look at right now, even in the age of where we're looking at this entire elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion that's happening across in these companies, because they played in our faces in the beginning and they asked us to believe them. And we did. We believed them so much that we really went into partnership with them. And under the fire of this administration and pressure, the same people who told us that we stand with you against the injustices that you all have been up against for all of these years, because of the stroke of a pen and because of an authoritarian who's in office right now, all of that is going away. And where are we back to? We're back to figuring it out. So I'll end with this. What we learned in 2020, we learned that collectively we can absolutely do this. But what we found out now is that if we can get that opportunity, if that opportunity come again, that we probably will have strategized and look for what does a sustainability plan look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that when I think about 2020 as a particular moment, I think it is really important that we view it in the context of being 100 years after Red Summer, 1919. Because I think this goes to, the point that everybody keeps lifting up, which is some of this is new, but most of it is not, right? And, 100 years ago in 1919, we had all of these race riots in particularly like urban cities where we had been relocating to. This is right after or around World War I, World War II era, right? A lot of economic strain. I think we were dealing with the Spanish flu at that point too. So I mean, a lot of echoes of history going on. And so I think once we reached 2020 and we had that moment with George Floyd, that didn't come out of nowhere. This is coming on a century, right, of us having this back and forth about Jim Crow and segregation and who has access to what, whether it's voting rights or equal pay, and all of these tensions once again coming to a boiling point. And I agree. I think what happened, I think there was a lot of positive things that actually happened as a result of that. And I think that is what scared the people who are now trying to destroy all of the infrastructure, because a lot of those underlying issues that we were addressing as a result of the pandemic, we were kind of forced to address, right? Were resolving a lot of things. It created a lot of opportunity for people that you said, like, working from home. It was, we were getting more innovative. We were addressing issues with our schools, especially in like rural areas. What do we do if the kids can't go to school? How can we build up our technological infrastructure, right? You had the Biden administration coming in and passing and instituting a lot of things. And a lot of what we're seeing now is the backlash from that. Because if we had kept on that path of expanding healthcare, of making sure that all the schools have equal infrastructure and technology access and all of that, we'd end up with democracy and racial equality.
Right.
And so a lot of the focus, I think, that's happening right now is our recognition that it's not just enough, like y'all has been said, to boycott and divest. What are we investing in? And I think that has been somewhat of a shift. Like, it's not just about how are we withholding our money for a little bit of time until you treat us right, to how are we just building our own things. And I think that, again, is an echo of, a century ago when we were not allowed to be a part of anything. We had to create our own everything. And so I think that we are seeing some echoes of that, whether it is the policing conversation, right? We're not just saying defund the police. We're saying let's take money from this massive budget that is given to the police and let's put some of that in other resources to address these same issues. Policing is not addressing homelessness. Let's take some of that budget that is given to the police to go out and kick people, off of the street, to having housing, that, because we know that a lot of the issues that we end up using police for essentially are really social issues. A lot of that stuff, if we want to address violence and social issues in the community, issues of public safety, a lot of that really falls outside of what the police do. Same thing with the boycott and divestment and sanctions movement around Israel. I think a lot of parallels there to South Africa. And I think it's important that we remember that 100 years ago, with apartheid South Africa, we knew that we were like moving towards that moment, and eventually we did. And it was ultimately the economic organizing that ended apartheid, whether it was in the southern United States or South Africa, or right now Israel. We're seeing a lot of breakthrough in that movement there.
Yeah, I know we want to move on, but I have to piggyback on that, because what I don't want to get lost in all the craziness that this administration is putting forward is that the point that Bree brought up is what we're seeing in these predominantly Black cities, where these mayors are making significant investment in non-militarization. in programs, after school programs, summer programs. That is what is ultimately creating this, historic decrease in violent crime, in murders, and shootings. And right now, that's being covered up in the midst of this by creating this false narrative around places like Washington, D.C. being, rampant criminality, or New York, or what have you. Shout out to, Chev and I both know Mayor Scott out of Baltimore.
Yep.
And if you know Brandon from his time on the Baltimore City Council to now his tenure as mayor, he's been talking about this from day one. This idea as being deeply rooted in Baltimore, in the history of Baltimore. We know, many of us know Baltimore through The Wire and that narrative that was created. But once he took office as mayor, he made it a point to make sure that there were investments in communities that had been historically underserved and underinvested for decades. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that if you do that, if you actually, since we're talking about the notion of where to invest this money, you invest it in the places that have been historically underfunded. And surprise, surprise, as we see in places like Birmingham, as we're seeing in places like Baltimore, as we're seeing in, in LA under Karen Bass, that, in the steps that, now Mayor Barbara Lee's taking in Oakland. We're seeing all these significant changes. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that we've done a piss poor job as a country of taking care of those who are closest to the problem, those who have been, victimized by the war on drugs, victimized by mass incarceration, and the failure to invest in those communities. And that surprisingly, when you make the investment in those communities, you see positive outcomes. Now, this current administration won't tell you that because they want to make everything black bad. But we know that to be a false narrative that has unfortunately plagued us for centuries now.
Really quick, 120 seconds. Senator Bullard, he said something, and Bree, she started it, which is so true. My degree is in biochemistry, and there in chemistry, you all know the word, but what it does is the significance of what a litmus test is. A litmus test is if I can test this particular solution, I know what I can use on the next one, and it can be consistent. So what we're seeing right now is an absolute litmus test. And the president and his administration they're not just strong arming. They're testing to see how far this can go. Whether that goes with the militarization of these, again, like Senator Bullock just said, are these black cities, or whether it's the opening of these concentration camps that's being opened up across the country. So I don't want us to lose sight of what we're seeing right in front of our eyes right now.
Well, that helps me move on in our line of questioning, because I was going to ask how we got things right in 2020 versus where we fell short. And you all kind of touched on quite a few of those examples. So 8 months in, how would you say our resistance tactics should shift in response to this greater shift towards authoritarianism, this bullying of private and the public sector? We've already seen how the anti-woke movement has staged hostile takeovers of universities and colleges around the country. It seems now that there has been this alignment with corporate America as well, with some exceptions. I think what was so painful with Target is they seemingly were very invested in being inclusive and beauty products, having black brands and all these things. They seemed on the surface incredibly invested in black entrepreneurs, right? Outside of the rollout of Black History Month, merch, right? Like it seemed to be a real investment, only to turn around in 2025, and they're like, psych, we lied, and stood 10 toes down on it as well. And now they're finding out how powerful the Black buying power really is now that we have separated ourselves from Target, right? And so my next question has to do with how do we sustain this, right? Like, I think because of social media and we get information quicker, right? But that also the flip side makes sustaining movements a little bit more challenging, if I'm being quite honest. Our attention spans are shorter, right? There's not always collective agreement on how we move forward in this authoritarian regime, in this environment we're living in. So the stakes are no less high, right? So how do our tactics shift in response for the long term?
Be honest with you, for sustainability to happen, we're going to have to get serious about who's sitting at the table and who we're putting at these tables to sit. In the moment that we're in right now, I'll be honest with you. I've been saying it, and I'm gonna keep saying it, that this is the moment to where we got to start picking leaders who are willing to take a page out of our profiles and courage. Because truth be told, symbolic gestures are not allyship. I mean, the real commitment requires policy change. It requires budget shifts. It requires courage in what's unpopular. And the only way that happens is those individuals sitting at the table. And I also say, be clear on how we, as far as these policy changes happening, and that's really us, what it looks like in us building a bench, because we can't sustain what we can't control. And we're asking for this sustainability, which it can absolutely happen. I don't know where Black folk get this idea that we some weak people, and we're not. We absolutely have the power to be able to do it, but the question is, are we willing to do the collective work and understand the leadership circle, knowing that I can't do what Dwight do, I can't do what Bree do, I can't do what Ryan do, and everybody can operate in a lane and we be successful, and us not do this. But if we don't figure that out, what we're seeing right now, I mean, it will continue just to us being reactive to a lot of the things that we're seeing, instead of us being proactive and us operating in our true strengths.
I would say, think global and buy local as a strategy, right? And what I mean by that is, too oftentimes, Black folks run away from being pan-Africanist. And what we've seen at our highest points of success is that when we've engaged globally with our partners across the diaspora, we start to see dividends being paid, as we start to see, the African Union organize itself on the continent, as we start to see, our Caribbean brothers and sisters, really shaking off the chains of colonization and understanding the material benefit of what tourism or agriculture or whatever means to their sustainability and how we move forward. I mean, Black folks in the United States, as the diaspora goes, are the most economically aggressive buyers, not only in the country, but globally, right? And so when we think about how we spend our money and where we spend our money, again, going back to us being able to find ourselves online when we were all stuck at home, now that we're offline, every time I pop up at a farmer's market or these pop-up shops, I tend to see more and more Black vendors. How are we then investing in those folks? We're seeing these things happen all the time. Afro tech happening. We just had Essence Fest in New Orleans. We have all the things, all the events, all the kind of creativity that has driven us and sustained us for so long. All these places are really underutilized because we're not tapping into them as often as we need to. When we think about Target, one of the things that I found interesting coming out of the Target boycott was how Black vendors within Target were being underpaid via Target. And so it was just like, yeah, we were all happy to see, you know, Black vendors on the shelves of Target before the boycott, but we didn't understand that Target was basically saying, all right, we'll buy, you know, a couple products here, we'll do some regional access here or there, not even understanding that it would be a greater benefit to them to patch into their websites directly and for us to buy in bulk from them directly. Last thing I would say is cooperatives. Don't lose sight of what that is. I mean, when we've been at our best, whether you want to call them flea markets, whether you want to call them estate sales or yard sales, whatever you want to call cooperative economics that Black folks have been doing for forever, we need to do that more often and with greater regularity. Because to Shev's point, if I know somebody that makes phenomenal chicken, and I know I make phenomenal sides, and I know somebody else that makes phenomenal desserts, that sounds like the opportunity to create a meal and sell that to community. So why aren't we then saying, using all those components and selling that to the larger community in mass, if we know that we're good at the things that we're good at? So we do have to tap more into this notion of being more cooperative with our economics.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I think that we have reached the limits of what is possible with inclusion and representation. And what I mean by that is like within the system as it exists, right? We all know this was a white supremacist system. This is a system built on slavery. It has been a slave plantation system far longer than it has been anything resembling a democracy, right? Or approaching anything that looks like a representative democracy. So what does it mean to seek inclusion and representation in that, right? And I think that's the difference between that and having actual political organization and economic infrastructure, right? Which I think is what we're speaking to. That's the difference between I have products on the shelf at Target, but Target is still paying me less than, you know, my white counterparts. Target can snatch my stuff off the shelf anytime they want to. I don't own a piece of Target, right? That's the difference between that and I have my own company that I own, and I have economic infrastructure between my customers and my suppliers, and you know that's a different thing. One is economic power, and the other one is more like an economic reliance, right? And I think that, and this is not anything new that I'm bringing up. I think this has been like kind of an ongoing conversation, right? Is kind of looking at where we were at like the height of the civil rights movement, which is what we, you know, look at a lot of times. How did we pull off something like a Montgomery bus boycott? How did we pull off the sit-ins and just the whole movement in general? And it's because at that point, we had to have economic infrastructure. There wasn't any other choice. I mean, I know we're all from the South. We all know this family history where it was like, you know, our uncle had the barbershop. And these are not wealthy people, but they own, you know, my great uncle had a farm, he had land, he could grow some food, and he had a barbershop that was patronized by people that lived around him. Again, not wealthy people, but economically empowered people to the point that they could fund a boycott. They could say, okay, we are not going to use public transportation, right, for over a year. That required coordination between the people who had to walk to work and the people who had cars, right? That required having meetings at Black-owned spaces, which were oftentimes churches or businesses, right? And so I think that in the pursuit, not that there's anything wrong with pursuing inclusion and representation, because these are things that we ultimately want to have for everyone, right? Like everybody should be able to participate in an economy. Everybody should have representation in government and in the society. But, and this is what I think Martin Luther King was really trying to get to kind of at, you know, the end there when he was assassinated, is that it's not, we can't just integrate into a burning house, right? Like we can't just seek inclusion and representation in something that is still not serving us. And so I think that what we are looking at now is the limits of that, not just being at the table, but having our own table. What does that look like? Like I said, not just being included, but owning. And the last thing I want to say to the cooperative, the mention of cooperatives, absolutely. I think we have to be willing to interrogate capitalism. That scares a lot of people, right? That scares a lot of people. This goes back to 1919 Red Scare. A lot of fears of they would use communism and racism together to kind of shut down any kind of conversation around capitalism. But we have to talk about this because the economic condition that we are in today is not separated from the fact that race and economic status are like this. And it's not real to pretend otherwise. Your race, for most of this nation's history, and I would argue even still today, more so than it doesn't, your race determines your economic status, right? And then even if you get to a point where you are, wealthy, racism is still going to limit your opportunities. We know, and this has been true for decades, a white person with a high school degree earns more over their lifetime than Black people with multiple degrees, right? That's racism. That's the function of race and generations of these kinds of practices. So we have to be willing to look at what is a solution for us in our communities. And a lot of times that has looked like cooperatives. That's looked like collective economic practices. And truth be told, we were doing that long before colonialism. That is something that we have always done to survive. And so I think we need to not only do that, but really understanding it critically as like an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, kind of framework that we have to operate in. I can't just get out here and try to make money for profit as a Black person. Realistically, it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way, and we see that if it worked that way, then as an individual at Target, I could make a whole bunch of money and I wouldn't have to coordinate with the community to do a boycott at Target because I'm being targeted because I'm Black, right? So I think we have to put all of that on the table and not be afraid to be honest about the way that the capitalist economy itself interacts with us specifically as Black people.
You bring up so many good points that leads me to my next question about how do we, in terms of the role boycotts, protests, and divestment play in the next phase, how do we evolve our tactics under threat? We've always, I should say heightened threat. We've always, in a white supremacist framework structure of oppression, we've always been under some sort of threat. It just has ebbed and flowed over the decades, right? It just shows up in different ways. And now it's like your head is on a swivel, right? It's coming on all sides. From an institutional standpoint, colleges, K through 12, Black women being pushed out of federal jobs, for example, in high numbers. So how do we evolve our tactics under threat? What's the pipeline we are building? Because, right, we have to think about succession proofing, say when we're leaving behind things, property and land to our descendants, right? There's a certain level of succession planning, right, that comes with that. And so what's that look like from an economic standpoint for us? Because it's very clear that this road is going to be very long and very hard and very rough, and we might not see the fruits of our labor immediately to fix what has gone down over the last 8 months, because the damage being done is like decades and decades worth of damage, and being clear about we might not see the victory right away, right? Like John Lewis knew that at some point we would get to a good place, not a perfect place, but a good place. And he recognized that he might not live to see it, but it was worth fighting for. So how are we evolving our tactics under threat, if that makes sense? Because even when we had our own, right? We had Rosewood, Florida. We have Eatonville. They're still fighting for their right to exist, to have their land in Black hands, right? Tulsa, they seem to want, and I mean, white supremacist power structure wants to destroy anything that we build on our own without their help, right? It's almost like an enviousness taking over when this idea that we can exist in spite of their threats and their terrorist behavior towards us. And so there's this innate need to blow that up and destroy it, right? And so there's also this safety conversation that has to happen for us, because we can't, law enforcement is not the first thing we think of when it comes to our community safety.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm
sorry, it's a loaded question, Dwight.
It is, but I guess the thing that always sticks out for me is the fact that we've always done it, right? Like one thing is true is that we live behind enemy lines, as they say, right? Like if we're going to be Black people, brown people, etc., existing in the American colonial construct, there's always going to be the inevitability of that jealousy that you pointed out, right? Like somebody, there's always going to be an Elvis Presley sitting at the juke joint taking notes, right? And so
Elvis Presley, Dwight, but I love it. I love the reference.
So when we talk about the evolution of our tactics and what we do, it is like recognizing that someone's going to always kind of co-opt our coolness, but that people cannot live without our coolness. Like, you understand what I'm saying? Like, it's fascinating to me. Like we talk about, them building this community in the Ozarks, that's going to be whites only and void of any Black people. And it's like, what are y'all going to do when y'all don't have a scapegoat to point to? Like when you're living in this literal vanilla environment, when your food don't taste the same, when your Taco Tuesday ain't hitting like it used to, like when you really, really boils down to how this country has grown, it's grown on the backs, the power, the ingenuity, the creativity of Black and brown people. Full stop. Rock and roll doesn't exist. Blues doesn't exist. Country music doesn't exist. It's like understand. Like I was caught up watching the notion of like how macaroni and cheese got to the U.S. and the fact that it was Sally Hemings' brother, who was the chef for Thomas Jefferson, who was like, "Yeah, I can freak that. I thank you, Italians, for giving me the pasta, but I'm gonna go put, I'm gonna put this stank on it like we know how to do." And the literal existence of whether it's Kraft or baked mac and cheese comes at the hands and the ingenuity of Black people, right? So one thing is, the reality is that that's going to be it. Our ingenuity and creativity is going to always emanate, do its thing, and we're always going to be met with resistance and folks who are going to sit there and gaslight us and make it seem like we didn't come up with the idea first. But we just got to keep creating because that's what we're good at. Because, and this is just my belief, the inevitability of white people realizing that they literally can't live without us if they're going to live here has to click in. You know what I'm saying? Like you're trying to get rid of all, these brown folks, and not to say that they are exclusive to the agricultural industry, but Mr. I'm gonna bring your egg prices down forgot that the people collecting the eggs don't look like him. Mr. I'm gonna bring your grocery prices down keeps forgetting that the people who are picking the berries, picking the oranges, picking the leaf vegetables, that are taking care of the cows, taking care of the chickens, are people of the broader global diaspora. So there's going to have to come a reckoning, an internal reckoning with white America, that you don't you don't move the world like you think you do. You know, you move it at the behest and at the grace, really, and at the intelligence of people who you continuously belittle. And until you decide to like get out of your own way and stop trying to keep your foot on the neck of those folks and realize that the only way the globe and this country is going to be successful is to, you know, allow these folks to make the room at the table that they need in order for this thing to keep moving, then you're going to fail yourself. And if you want to keep doing that, you can keep doing that. But we're going to keep doing what we've always done, which is always be builders and not destroyers.
Preach, Brother Dwight.
Right. I think we're both like, how do we jump in?
Listen, I'm like, you're preaching a word.
Yeah. So again, I think we have seen the full possibilities of what inclusion and representation can bring us. And thank you to everybody that, you know, fought the fight and got the inclusion and got the representation. And a lot has been advanced since that. I'm thinking about all of the Black politicians that were elected to office for the first time since Reconstruction, right? I'm thinking about all of the Black federal workers and how that has changed so much, and which is why they're trying to get rid of so many of them, right? Because once you fill the government with Black workers, it's going to be hard to not have some kind of racial analysis coming into the work that's being done, right? But that said, when I say that we need to move beyond that, I don't think that's the same as segregation, right? It's not saying that we are trying to segregate ourselves or isolate ourselves. But again, it goes back to having economic infrastructure and political organization, which are the basis of power. And to me, I feel like there's three things maybe I would say that we like really need to focus on. I think divestment and / reinvestment is more critical than boycotting, because boycotting, again, to me, it's this idea that our goal is to still participate, right? So our goal is for you to have us back, you know, Target, treat us right, and we'll start giving you our money again. That's not really shifting power dynamics. That's more of like a very kind of passive, not to say that it's never useful, right? Because I do think that there are times where that makes sense to do, to have a strategy where it's like, okay, we're going to withhold our money until, right? But in terms, again, going back to that sustainability, that's not enough. We have to look at where are we reinvesting, divesting from white supremacist ideologies, divesting from white supremacist infrastructures. And I think that is happening across the board, across industries, across spaces, because everything has been built upon racism, right? It's not possible to divest economically without divesting all these other ways. We don't want to just elect Black faces in high spaces that still do the same white supremacist agenda, right? We don't benefit from the CEO of the company being Black if the company is still oppressing Black workers and poisoning our water supply, right? And so I think it's like a shift that has to happen kind of in our whole strategy, where it's really about breaking away. It's really, and that's the second thing I was going to say, decolonization, right? And pan-Africanism, as I think Senator Bullard, I think was the one that brought it up before. I think that is so critical. I know we have people that engage in what they call like the diaspora wars and all this kind of stuff, but you cannot, in my view, have any kind of real political, economic, social response to white supremacy, right, and racism without a Pan-African lens, because that's what it was. It was the oppression was based on our Blackness, on our Africanness. And so if we are not operating with an understanding of that, if we're still trying to operate as individuals, again, like we as Black people in America cannot operate like a European immigrant who just got here yesterday. A white European immigrant can get here yesterday and have way more opportunities made available to them simply off the strength of being white than a Black person who has been descended from generations and generations and generations of Black Americans here, right? That's the analysis we have to operate with when we're talking about economic strategy. So we can't do things the way that other people do. There is fundamentally a limit to our inclusion and our ability to participate in it the way that others do. And the last thing that I would say is that, again, comes back to really understanding what it means to be anti-fascist and anti-capitalist. I love to keep bringing up history because I think history, we learn so much from it. Again, all of these are echoes of what was happening a century ago, right? You have people, working class people, are really feeling economic strain, and you have fascists in power. Instead of providing actual economic solutions, they just scapegoat people. They get us to turn against each other and to try to act as individuals, so they can try to avoid addressing any of the real problems. And the only way that we combat that is through the collectivism. We say, okay, well, we know the government's not going to do anything about the shortage of food supply. So how are we feeding ourselves, right? How do I go support my local, local Black farmers or people who are producing locally, and also, as was said earlier, thinking globally, right? So I have a global understanding of how I fit into this system, right? I understand how it connects to all of these other things, but I'm taking action locally because my dollars are local. I mean, our dollars are always local. So what can I do? How can I permanently divest from Target? The thought should not just be, when does Target start treating us right so we can go back? It should be a wrap. Like, it should be that's it. We don't shop there anymore, and we use that as an opportunity to create alternatives. And that's the sustainability. We don't go back. We have our alternatives. We build a new economy, essentially. And I do think that's happening in some ways. We just have to have the, deliberation and the strategy around it.
So you touched on how we recalibrate, right, resistance strategies. And so it got me thinking of the coalitions that it took to dismantle apartheid in South Africa, so much so that corporations even were pressured to the point of divestment and removing and isolating South Africa into, I hate to say it, submission, right? But that's sometimes what it takes. So how do we take what worked in the past and apply it to the present, and building those strong coalitions in a polarized economy, one, to pressure brands, tech companies, because some of these tech companies are complicit, right, with this level of oppression, and university to ask, or should we just cut ties, right? How do we continue to try and build you kind of touched on it. You mentioned having a pan-African lens, but also how do you build those strong coalitions? I know that the Latino Freeze movement is also boycotting Target, among other businesses. So how do we build those same coalitions in this environment? Now, you touched on it briefly, but Chev, I want to go to you with that question.
Yeah, listen, I mean, first of all, to Bree and Dwight, man, listen, I'm sitting here, I'm taking notes. Y'all just sitting here talking. I am in school right now. Y'all don't even understand, man. Like, listen, like we got to be okay with linking our movements together. I mean, because like it's okay for you to have your vision and move that vision and work towards something, which I believe, when you're trying to get to the mountaintop, we all trying to get there, and we're trying to get there collectively is what I hope we are. But when we have these separate movements that's happening, that's really trying to do the same thing, I think we hurt ourselves more than anything, because now we're competing with each other. And so when we talk about this collective movement, I love how Dwight made mention of it, is of talking about how during the civil rights movement, how they were able to collectively move an agenda without Facebook, without YouTube, without Instagram, without all these things. It was because they understood the collective struggle. And they moved collectively because they always trying to get somewhere. And the only reason why, y'all got to excuse me, the only reason why I believe that we are back in the predicament that we're in right now, because we got so comfortable and we believe them. And so now we are in a situation where you got Black folk who believe that they have to put themselves in the opposite place of leadership against their own people in order to win. And I'm talking about individuals who have gone on the side of the oppressors, and they call it their conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
And while truth be told, if you were riding in the street at night, you, me, and Dwight Bullard would be treated the same. But we've forgotten because we've gotten so desperate. Forget divesting away from companies. Individuals have divested from who they are. And I'm talking about as Black folk.
Community.
They've totally disassociated themselves with community. So that's why we have Black leaders who are in positions who are okay with the bulldozing of Black communities and allowing developers to play in their face and call it affordable housing. And now we're in a predicament to where now Black folk don't know where to go, and now they are unhoused. And now you got the unhoused want to be arrested by the authoritarian.
Mm-hmm.
It's a domino effect. And until we get to a place where we understand that, we're going to keep having these conversations. And Bree, you're right. Our young people, and I wrote this down because as Bree was talking, I wrote it down. I said, our young people, they watching, but they are not waiting for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They are most certainly not.
Mm-hmm.
My nephew and my brother-in-law, these Gen Zers, they're watching us, but they're not waiting on us. They're watching us to see how far we're going to go before we call it quits. Because I'm telling you, not only are they ready, but they're willing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chev, you hit the nail on the head. With young people, there's a gerontocracy in Congress, right? And dare I say it's some gatekeeping, and that's at all levels. You know, there's this need to hold on to the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this fear of letting others take over and take the reins, so that that person that held it can rest, right? And there's also this narrative around what's the right way to do a thing. And so, what innovations and protest tactics emerged, in your opinion, in 2020? And what tools do we need now? Some of you have already kind of touched on it, to protect our organizers under increased political repression. To be quite frankly, there have been waves of state legislatures that have decided that they are going to demonize and criminalize protesting. Hey, Florida. Hey, girl. First out the gate to do that. Yes. Some bills moving through Tennessee and some other states where they changed where and how you could protest. Tennessee talking about you can hit somebody with your car for a minute there if they're blocking the road. So how do we I guess adjust, right? Like, because at some point it's already dangerous to protest during this administration, right? But now you have got the added pressures of ICE, National Guard. The Pentagon is planning on having its own military reaction force for civil unrest, the targeting of cities led by Black mayors, and I could go on. So I guess, and to your point, Chev, like, young people are like, okay, what we doing in addition to protesting? What we doing in addition to voting? Because you told me to vote, right?
Yep. Did that.
This man, and then Humpty Dumpty became president,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do now? And having the humility to help guide, right? Because I know when I was moving through this work, some of our elders were gatekeeping and thought that I was trying to replace them. And I wasn't. I was looking for knowledge. I was looking for guidance in this work, you know, because there's something to be said for institutional knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also something said to know when it's time to go and let the youngins take it, right? So I know I said a lot, but like, what are some of the tactics from 2020 or even happening now that you're seeing in these politically repressive times we're in?
I would say one big thing, I think that we have also come to understand the limits of social media, right? Because that was something else that came up, right?
Yeah,
like,
you're right.
Like a very powerful tool, able to connect us very quickly, spread information. And I think part of what made social media such a powerful tool in recent years was because there was so much stuff happening that was just being completely ignored by like mainstream journalism. Trayvon Martin is an example. Ferguson. I mean, there were so many things that were major events that had it not been for our connectivity, people, you know, on the street with their phone connected to somebody else on the street with their phone, we wouldn't have even known that it was going on. That said, we also have to look at misinformation and the way that this is being weaponized against us now. Mass surveillance, right? It may not serve you to broadcast every protest that you are participating in right now. You know, we don't necessarily need to see it. And I know sometimes people are like, where's the protest? Where's the protest? But it's not always safe to have everybody's face out there, right? So I think we have to be careful about like what is the value of it, right? Because there are, I think, like, for instance, filming ICE showing up, that's very powerful. We want people to see what's happening, spreading the word about things like that. But you know, you also need to recognize that they are trying to build databases of people's faces. So if you go out to protest, you might want to wear a mask, not just because, you know, COVID is still out here floating around, but it can also protect you from surveillance. So there's an added layer of technology that we are having to deal with. I also think we need to be very real about policy differences. There is an age gap. There is something of gatekeeping, I think. But I think there's also some real policy differences, and we have to be real about that. You know, there's some real policy disagreements. And it's okay for us to be in agreement that what we have right now is not working, right? We're in agreement about that, but maybe we're in disagreement about how we address it. Okay, that's fine. That's the beginnings of political organization, right? That's the beginnings of us having our own conversations and figuring out exactly how are we moving. Of course, I'm going to be with the young people because they're the ones that inherited it. And they're the ones that have to live through the next 50 years. They should be the ones to be setting the policy. Even if you disagree, you don't think that's how it should be. Okay, well, you know, let's be real. It doesn't make sense for people who have been in power for 50 years to be determining what the next 50 years is going to be like. And especially when we're looking at a situation where the young people have inherited so much devastation, you know, haven't inherited the level of wealth that older generations have inherited and opportunities that they had. So I think that, you know, acknowledging that, letting folks lead, it's time to pass the torch. It is, you know, as respectfully as possible. Time to pass the torch, you know.
Well, and you know, even in the civil rights movement, there were disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Ella Baker.
Anyone?
There were these nuanced conversations going on, even in the civil rights movement, right? Like, there's this narrative that everybody was on board and everyone was getting along, and that's not necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's fair for that to also be the case now. And sometimes disagreements lead to shifts in direction, right? Like you find the allies in strange places sometimes, and when it comes to the issues that we are fighting for. And so my next question is, how can creatives, you know, we've seen a lot of the influencers, some of which I follow, some not so much, because you can have the podcast bros be loud and wrong a lot of the time. But how we know a few of them, I'm not going to name any names, but what role do creatives play, right? Because we know all the ways in which it can go wrong, right? And misinformation is a real thing, even in some of the podcast spaces that our work shows up in. So how can creatives, your influencers, your artists, especially when we're involved? Because I have my own views about celebrity involvement, because sometimes it just feels real transactional. So how can creatives be involved in a transformational way?
So I gotta flip the question a little bit, because it kind of plugs in to the previous one. There's a lack of political creativity with Black folks. And let me tell you what I mean.
Okay.
When it comes to artists and creatives, we will dream big. Like the improvisational nature of jazz should be studied, right, as a creative tool. The ability to dance on TikTok, create Black Twitter, etc., should be studied in terms of our ability to generate and regenerate creativity in those spaces that allow for the freedom of traditional creativity. What kills me as somebody who served in political office is the lack of political creativity that we oftentimes possess. And the reason I say this is because I look at somebody like Shirley Chisholm. When Shirley Chisholm got elected as the first Black woman in Congress, they tried her off rip by putting her on the Agricultural Committee. Black woman from Brooklyn, we're going to stick you on this committee with a bunch of Dixiecrats, rural farm boys from the South. And somehow the SNAP program gets created. Now, the reason I bring this up is because for a sister from Brooklyn to be on this committee where she probably doesn't know really what's going on requires her to sit back and listen. And probably what she heard first was that there's a federal subsidy to grow or not grow vegetables and fruits. And I have a community in Brooklyn that needs access to vegetables and fruits. So how do I create a pathway for these folks who don't like me to use the resources of the federal government to get them back to the people that I serve in Brooklyn? That's political creativity. And what I'm saying for us is we lack it sometimes. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we don't make historical connections to things. And we've all been guilty of it, right? Like, for years it was police reform, police reform, police reform. Sounded great because we were all operating from this principled position that if enough Black folks got hired as police officers, if we could change the hue of the department, then oppression would all of a sudden magically stop. And guess what? We were wrong. Fast forward to 2020, right? And so when defund comes along, whether you want to argue it or not, what people were basically saying was, you've got this thing that's taking up 60% of a city's budget to be used to oppress and harass oftentimes less than 30% of the city's population. That math ain't mathing. That I'm kicking out money for my own oppression. And then I have to ask you why the park is closed, why the pool isn't open, and I live in a state like Florida, and somehow the pool's only open in the summer. Why are these things happening? And so, long story long, I'm simply saying that we have to be in the business of connecting our history, right? The long arc of history of oppression in this country with deconstructing, dismantling those systems and solving real life problems using the finite resources that we have. And so bringing it back full circle, when I talk about a Brandon Scott, in Baltimore, we talk about Brandon Johnson in Chicago, or we talk about what these Black mayors are doing, it's somebody finally coming along and saying, we've done it. As we've had Black mayors in these cities who said, I'm just going to be a Black mayor who does what my white counterpart used to do, and do the same thing. I'm going to keep reinvesting in police. I'm going to keep spending more money on these oppressive tactics and getting no return on that investment. And someone finally coming along and saying, if we took some of these resources and made this investment here, how is this going to change these so-called problems that that seem to be pervasive? Surprise, surprise. Crime goes down. Quality of life goes up. New job opportunities happen. I remember somebody telling me when I first got to office, that there are 9 jobs attached to every criminal, which means that we've been using crime as a job creation program in this country for centuries. Whether it's a judge, a bailiff, a lawyer, a public defender, you name it, somebody is getting employed off of criminality. No one's ever thinking about how do we reduce the need for crime. And if crime, if we know it, is really based on the lack of or the need for something, how do we increase that level of food security, housing security?
Mm-hmm.
How do we end domestic violence? How do we create situations where kids don't go hungry into school? And if we actually started getting into the practice of solving those issues and making that the primary objective of our creativity politically, we wouldn't be dealing with half the stuff we're dealing with now. Now, I get it. White folks don't want to deal with that because they want the boogeyman to exist. As long as you can scapegoat black and brown people and say that people are eating cats and dogs and stealing and doing this and doing all the things, you get to perpetually keep white supremacy going.
Mm-hmm.
But for black and brown people in positions of power, whether you're a mayor, senator, governor, what have you, your whole objective for the time you're in office needs to be about the creativity of problem solving of the actual root problems and root causes, and stop perpetuating the same oppressive tactics that have been out there for years.
Amen. Amen. I mean, I agree 1000%. And like, I love that answer, because I do think a lot of things have been very celebrity focused just because it's a celebrity obsessed culture, and I think political creativity, absolutely. And I think it's also creativity with the purpose. It's like, what is the purpose? I think that's part of what Senator Bullard was getting at too. It's like Shirley Chisholm was operating with a purpose. She wasn't just coming in saying, I got a title and, I'm just going to be here and do whatever I have to do to keep my title. And I think there's unfortunately too much of that going on across a lot of different sectors. And so I think it is creativity, whether it's political creativity, artistic creativity, creativity in the academic sector, creativity in the medical field. How are we reimagining systems and being creative in that, not just trying to keep repairing what we already know doesn't work, right? I mean, and even the idea that the system's not working, the system's working excellently. It keeps getting more and more refined. We figured out how to integrate Black people into the system, and it just keeps doing the thing that it's always been doing. And so I think as far as like celebrities specifically and artists specifically, I think the reality is that in times like this, unless you are speaking to that, it's getting to a point that you're not really relevant. Now, you can do whatever you want to do, but I think part of what we are seeing too is just that people are kind of tired of performative activism. It's not enough to just say, oh, I believe in love and I believe in people. It's like, okay, well, how is that showing up though in your actions? How is that showing up in you taking a risk, possibly, if you are a powerful person or somebody with a lot of influence, because there's no standing on the sidelines. There's just not. There's no such thing as being. There's never such a thing as being neutral, but especially not in a time like this. You can't be on the fence. You just can't. And so I think that no matter what people's profession is or whatever, how are you thinking creatively, right, to help us collectively better this situation?
This conversation is so good. I don't want it to end. But we're getting close to the end of our programming. But I do want to ask our final 2 questions that connect to what you were saying, right? We can't stand on the sidelines any longer, right? What does a meaningful win look like for our movements, especially those engaging in boycotts or protests in 2025? And there's always the inevitable resistance fatigue, right? And what sort of care and support structures must be in place or could be in place to sustain long-term organizing? Because you can't pour from an empty cup, right? That's the saying. And so those are some of the things I think about on a regular basis, because a lot of us deal with burnout. So what's a measurable win, and then how do we prepare for that resistance fatigue?
I mean, I can jump in. I mean, for me, it again, I think comes back to sustainability. So if it's not sustainable to me in this context, it's not really a win. That we have not figured that out, because the fatigue comes from the fact that it's not sustainable. So like, for instance, we can say support your local businesses and support your local food sources, but if that still is way more difficult or inaccessible than going to McDonald's or whatever, I'm not realistically going to change that. So as we are organizing, and we are telling people to move their dollars and do these things, we have to do that in a way that people can realistically do it. We can't expect people to be anything more than human. And a lot of our current situation is because it has been comfortable enough. Right? Like, not that everybody's comfortable and relaxed, but it's comfortable enough to kind of stay in the dysfunction and, doing things the way that we have always done it. And I think that's just how people tend to respond to things. People realistically, in times of crisis or pressure, they lean into what they already know how to do, because that's easier than trying to learn a new way of being. And so I think everything needs to be looked at from the lens of, can we do this not just for 2 months, but for the next 50 years? Like, how are we setting this up to be a new system and a new way of existing, and not just a temporary kind of response or reaction?
Yeah, I would add that, multiple things can be true at the same time. So we can note Black progress and still also recognize that there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think people, in thinking about the incremental wins or smaller wins, should be able to see that clarity, that yes, you can have a cup of coffee next to a white person. Congratulations. However, there are other things that we need to progress on as well. And to be able to work on those things. I think we rob ourselves when we diminish the ability to dream big and think fantastically, right? I remember a conversation a few years ago listening to Ryan Coogler talking about Black Panther before it came out, and kind of like this idea of Afrofuturism, like, thinking about this place called Wakanda, and of course, this futuristic place where everything seems perfect, but he kept going back to the point that it's like, we've already done this. Like, all the things I'm pulling from are things like Mansa Musa, Timbuktu, like things that we've done and shown historically that we've been able to sustain ourselves through centuries. I just want to remind us that Black folks have been doing this thing arguably for the last 50,000 years. And when I mean Black, I mean African-looking, Black, highly melanated people have been doing this thing for 50,000 years. So we've been sustaining for a while. Don't let the hiccup of chattel slavery make it seem like that's the entirety of our history, right? Like, we've built civilizations. We've seen places crumble and fall. The Moors controlled Europe when Columbus decided to swindle the King of Spain into funding his colonial program. Like, those, like, we've always been around, and we're always going to be around. So don't lose sight of that. And I think that also plays into the fatigue. We got to know ourselves. We got to know from whence we came. We got to know that it is that there is life beyond what we, the hardships that we exist in sometimes. Like, one of the most inspirational things that I had the chance to do was, of course, visit to the continent for an extended period of time. And I remember I was there, and after about week 2 of what was a 5-week stint, I felt myself like at ease. I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And I realized it was the absence of racism. Like, it can exist. It does exist. Like, and I was like, the biggest aha moment was the idea that I could be in a place and not feel the burden of racism that I feel in the United States. And I'm not saying that to say that places don't have problems or other things don't exist. What I'm saying is the possibility exists. So when I came back from that experience, now that I had the knowledge that that is possible, that is what I'm building towards. So that is what drives me in the work. And that is what keeps me from the burnout, is that I know it's possible. It's not a theoretical concept. It's the fact that it literally exists. And that if we can create constructs similar to do that, that the world can be a better place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We've come to the end, everyone, and I just want to thank you for joining me tonight and sharing your insights, your expertise, your clarity, your encouragement, your all the things, your stories. And to our audience, thank you for sticking with us. We went a little bit over, but this conversation was really good, and I didn't want to stop it. Thank you for showing up and staying engaged. Please follow Black Voters Matter on all our social media handles. Dwight, do you want to drop the Instagram for Florida Rising?
Sure thing, sure thing. You can hit me up personally at Dwight Bullard _ on IG. You can find Dwight Bullard on Facebook. I don't do the TikTokies and some of the newer stuff. You gotta catch me on the old school social media. But you can find Florida Rising on all the newer social media spaces at FL Rising, including we have TikTok content as well. So
Free.
Twitter is probably where, if people are engaging with me, that's probably going to be the best spot right now. Or I still call it Twitter. I don't care. At Bree Newsome. And I'm actually in a writing phase right now, so I'm not posting a whole lot. I'm really kind of taking a break from social media, not super active, but that's one of the places I go to comment. So if you want to connect with me, that's probably the best.
Well, all right, everybody. This concludes our panel, our policy corner. On behalf of Black Voters Matter, we thank you all for watching. I want to thank our esteemed guests. Stay safe, stay active, and stay in the fight. Black Voters Matter 365, and we fight back.